Okay, let's open in a word of prayer. Lord, we pray that you'll watch over us today. We pray that you'll help us understand any insights that we might bring to the current situation in the world. Pray that you'll bless our hearts today. In Jesus' name, amen. Well, today I'm going to talk about an empire of signs. Now, I'm not very creative. Sometimes I pick up these titles from... I might just make a connection between a couple things. Like there was a few weeks ago, I called it dire straits because there were problems in the straits there off the west coast of Saudi Arabia in the Red Sea, and there was also the Straits of Hormuz in the Persian Gulf. So I thought, well, let's do something with straits. And I don't necessarily try to be that clever, but today I'm basing this on a speech that I'm going to play a little bit of at the end, right at the end, which will be in like another 20 minutes or so. And it was a speech given by Florence Parly, who is the director or head of the armed forces of France. And so here's what she said. This is a small clip of what she said in her speech in Bahrain. It was either yesterday or Friday at the Monomar Dialogue.
The Middle East is an empire of signs. Nowhere is the art of messaging more sophisticated, and nowhere is a propensity to interpret symbols stronger than in this region.
So she was speaking in the Middle East, and she said, this is an empire of signs, and symbols and everything are very important when we communicate about this. And this is very similar, though, I might add, to what Scripture says, because Scripture tells us that we will live in a time of the signs. Just as the people at the first coming of Christ lived with signs that indicated that the Messiah was come, his first coming was going to take place, we live in a time where the signs indicate that the second coming of the Messiah is going to take place. And there's a lot of symbols in Scripture and culture, and there's a lot of symbols in Scripture that are to communicate ideas about that. Now, the symbols sometimes are not exactly correct. They're not precise. They're not exact. They're sort of shadows of what's going to happen. But I think we can have a pretty good understanding, and we talk a lot about this, about the convergence of all these different signs, and the fact that we live in a world that seems to be very disrupted. And as we get closer to this period of time we call the 70th week, and when it begins, there will be a lot of disruption. There's going to be a lot of things taking place. And as I've said before, my view of how all these things unfold is that the seals open, and I can tell you I have good friends who believe that the seals open before the beginning of the 70th week. Some say, no, it has to be in the 70th week. But what I do know is that these seals will open and that there are things that come about as those seals open, but there's sort of a crescendo, a building to a big climax. They don't open and immediately everything that's in that seal takes place. They unfold over a period of time. And they might be unfolding. It doesn't mean that seal 1 opens and then everything in seal 1 takes place. Then seal 2 opens and everything, and therefore I think they overlap quite a bit, that you'll see parts of all of these seals. Once they start unfolding, you'll see all of them. And listen, I have a lot of good friends, good Christian brothers. Some of them think that these things are opening right now. Now, I'm not convinced of that yet, but I think we're certainly very close to seeing a lot of these things. Someone made this, and I'll give her credit privately. But she brought up an interesting verse, a passage out of Isaiah chapter 22 that I think has some applicability. Now remember, Isaiah was a prophet that prophesied before the Assyrian captivity. And you can read about things that were going on at that time in Isaiah, around Isaiah chapter 35 and 36, and the invasion of Sennacherib. You can also read about it in the books of Chronicles. And he worked with Hezekiah, and he was a prophet before the first captivity. So things that he prophesied, and as we have noted many times before, when prophets prophesied, they prophesied for very often 3 time periods. They prophesied for the time period in which they lived. They prophesied for the first coming of Christ, and they prophesied for the second coming of Christ. And so the same prophecy might have multiple applications. So here's just an interesting passage, I think, and the last verse or 2 is, I think, where the money quote is. But the burden of the valley of vision, this is how he starts off chapter 22. And then in verse 17 he says this, "Behold, the Lord will carry thee away with a mighty captivity," speaking to the northern kingdom of Israel, that they're going to be judged, that there's somebody coming. And it was a year ago, Pam and I were in London, a year ago this week, and we went to the British Museum. And at the British Museum, you see these massive stone carvings that they took from the city of Nineveh and other places in the Assyrian Empire. And there's rooms of these things, and they tell a story. And very often, they tell a story about characters that are in the Bible, one of whom is Sennacherib. And you can see the relief in the things that are happening with Sennacherib and the tribute that he's getting. And this is stuff that confirms the Bible. And it was interesting when we were there a year ago, and I can't remember the guy's name, but they were talking about this Assyrian king. And they had a special exhibit about artifacts related to this king. And it was called, and the title was, the name of the guy, began with the letter A, King of Assyria, King of the World. And it sort of sent a chill up my spine when I saw that, because of what we know is coming about this future Antichrist. And there, literally written in stone, are things about these Assyrian kings. But anyway, the burden of the valley of vision, verse 17, "Behold, the Lord will carry thee away with a mighty captivity, and will surely cover thee. He will surely violently turn and toss thee like a ball into a large country. There shalt thou die, and there the chariots of thy glory shall be the shame of thy Lord's house. And I will drive thee from thy station, and from thy state he will pull thee down. And it shall come to pass in that day that I will call my servant Eliakim, the son of Hilkiah, and I will clothe him with thy robe, and strengthen him with thy girdle, and I will commit thy government into his hand, and he shall be a father to the inhabitants of Jerusalem and to the house of Judah. And the key of the house of David will I lay upon his shoulders, so he shall open, and none shall shut, and he shall shut, and none shall open." Now, we can argue about the applicability of that last verse 22, but the takeaway that I get from this is that God is in control. And then when God opens things up, no man is going to shut it. No one is going to, in other words, as these things start to unfold, we can try, but this is part of God's plan, and they're going to happen. And this week, I think we saw that a lot of things that were going on that I think are applicable. So let me just look at a few of those. Now, one of the ones that I think is interesting is an article, and I look at a lot of different newspapers. I have become a very big fan of Google Translate, and translate large portions of, particularly since I think a lot of the Bible prophecy is tied to the Middle East, because that's where a lot of these things are going to unfold. I look at Arabic newspapers, I look at Iranian newspapers, and Google Translate does a pretty good job of translating these things for you. Now, fortunately, some of the Arabs post their newspapers in English, and this is Arab news. And I find it very interesting that this is a Muslim man writing in Arab news, and he has this opinion about transhumanism. Now, we've talked a bit about transhumanism in the past, not as much lately, but transhumanism is this belief, essentially, that we're going to merge man and machine. And it's interesting that this Arabic man, now, in the Bible prophecy community, we believe that this transhumanism and that sort of thing has implications regarding what we know as the mark of the beast. and the technology that might be used by the Antichrist to implement some of the prophecies that we see in Revelation. No one will buy or sell without the mark. Now, my personal view is that whenever that gets here, it'll be pretty apparent that this is the mark that you should avoid taking. But certainly, I believe that there's a technological aspect to it, but the more important thing, I think, is the spiritual aspect and the pledging of loyalty to this coming son of perdition. But it's interesting that this Muslim man says this is transhumanism is a dangerous leap for humanity. And he talks about microchipping, getting things in your hand and that type of thing that will allow people to monitor you, that he says, and I would agree with him, having been through yet another credit card getting hacked this week or whatever, and having to replace my credit cards and going out and having to re-enter all that information at all these places that have automatic billing. Sometimes you think, boy, and my wallet is, gets thicker and thicker with all the junk that I have to put in it. Certainly I couldn't put it in my back pocket and sit on it comfortably. It's big. And sometimes you think, boy, and he makes this point that when this thing happens, it'll be a good idea. There'll be a practical aspect to it that'll be very good. But there's also a downside, and he talks about the downside in this article. So you can find that why transhumanism is a dangerous leap for humanity. Now, again, I don't trust everything that I read in the New York Times, but I do believe that they do have one of the largest news gathering organizations, and they actually do come up with facts. It's just the way you have to learn how to read newspapers like this to get through the spin that they try to put on everything. But there were a couple really good articles in the past week or so, one of which was this release about a week ago of leaked papers that they were able to get out of China that talked about how China is persecuting the Uyghurs. This is a group of Muslims. China views them as terrorists and a threat to China. So in Western China, they have started these internment camps. They call them re-education camps. And what goes on there is horrific. And there was they did a good job of documenting this. There's upwards of 1 million or 2 million people currently in these camps in China. And you can see them in satellite, before and after satellite pictures, and see how large they've grown. The interesting thing is that most of the Muslim countries never say a peep about it. So this has an impact. Now, partly I think that a lot of the Muslim countries don't say anything about this is because they are economically shackled to China. China has been very good about making loans for infrastructure, and essentially you pledge your assets and everything you have to China. And China has engaged in this process. Now, one of the aspects that China is trying to do is they're trying to recreate, they call it the Belt and Road Initiative. They're trying to create the old Silk Road to allow travel and flow of goods between China and Europe and Asia and even down into Africa. But one of the areas where China doesn't have the greatest control of its own country is in Western China, where the Uyghurs are. So they are trying to, they put people in, and it's a re-education camp they say that they go in, but the purpose is to educate others that you don't do that. I do believe that what's going on with regard to the Uyghurs, though, is a big aspect of what is happening with regard to Hong Kong. And I'll talk about that in a moment. So there are a number of things that are happening. Now, in Palatine, and again, I hesitate, I hate to beat a dead horse, but I do think that this whole LGBTQ thing that's going on is very, very important from a Bible prophecy standpoint. This is really, in my view, it has will lead to tearing the fabric of society. I think Attorney General Barr, he gave a speech. I played a little bit of it at Notre Dame. He also gave a speech about a week ago to the Federalist Society. And in that speech, he sort of built on the themes that he had brought up at the Notre Dame Law School speech. And he said that what these secularists have done is they've created essentially a religion without God, where it's a religion of humanism and man. And it's pretty... Listen, when Barr was hired, I know he had been Attorney General 25 or more years ago. I don't think anybody expected him to be going out and giving sort of philosophical speeches about what's really going on in our society, but I think he's done a very good job of sort of encapsulating and highlighting the important issues that we're facing. So this is Palatine, Illinois. And in Palatine, a young man claimed to be transgender, a woman, a girl, and he sued the school district. And for the last several years, the school district has been wrestling with the issue because he wants to use the girls' locker room. And there are people in support of this, and there are people against it. You see here some of the supporters. Do you see the signs that these people are holding? Trans students belong in locker rooms. That's not what they're saying. They're saying that boys who think they're girls belong in girls' locker rooms. And people are upset about this. So they had a vote the other night. And so I have a little interview with the man, this young man before the vote. Then they'll interview him right after. And then response of a student who, along with others, has opposed this, and I think you can see that it's a pretty big issue. So here's a little clip from that.
So I'm really hoping that the district makes the right decision here and votes it. Yeah, it passed. It passed.
And how does it make you feel?
Oh, I'm ecstatic. I'm sorry.
I feel uncomfortable that my privacy is being invaded. As I am a swimmer, I do change multiple times naked in front of the other students in the locker room. And I understand that the board has an obligation to all students, but I was hoping that they would go about this in a different way that would also accommodate students such as myself.
So she was kind of emotional about it because, I mean, she's a teenager, and this is not something that she wants to be doing. And this is divide. And when you look at these communities, it's like 50-50. It's like everything in the world now is like 50-50. One before, against, everybody's fighting over these things. There's not much. The only consensus is that we disagree with everybody else. There's not a lot of consensus. Now, the next thing, I've wrestled with whether I should play this next clip. I actually went through. There is a website out there to show you some of the things that are being played to young kids. I can't play it in good conscience. I cannot show you, now process this, I cannot show you adults what they're showing to kids in schools. Now, so I'm going to play a little bit without audio. It's called Sex Ed School. And here are these people talking about sex ed. And one of the things that they do, they have these little characters that they bring up. They bring in these drag queens. They have these little dolls. You can see one down there in the lower right-hand corner. And what they will do is they will give them in this video, what they did was they taught the kids to masturbate. I don't know how else to describe it. And you can see, I don't know if I left any of the children in. I was afraid that Facebook would ding my thing. It's a classroom of like 6, 7-year-olds. I'm not making this up. You know, I had a friend on Facebook who posted a video about this, and Facebook blocked it. because it wasn't appropriate. But if you criticize them giving this to children, you can get put in Facebook jail. So I don't know how long this video will stay up, but this is, there are extensive websites, all kinds of different websites, if you start looking into it, of what they're teaching children. And parents' concerns, I showed you what that teacher down around Houston said last week. You parents don't know enough that we teachers should be teaching your kids. Now look, there are a lot of good teachers that are deeply disturbed and troubled by this. But what I'm trying to tell you is Isaiah 22:22. When the door is opened, it won't be shut. How do you walk this back? And my concern is this whole generation that's going to be taught this way in schools. And I will reiterate again, as tough as it is, and I know there are good public schools still, but you have to be very, very careful these days. This is Palatine, Illinois. This is a suburb of Chicago. This is a suburb where there are large mega churches that this is happening. This is, upper middle class America. And it passes the school boards. And the votes are usually, I think there were 2 people that voted against this out of 7. But you go down to Austin, Texas, and these things pass unanimously, the sex ed curricula. And they enact it by law and make it happen in California. So I just think this is one of those things that I find to be very troubling. This is another little editorial. I'm going to kind of jump around a little bit, and then I'm going to get to Israel and Middle East. But this is an old age will put China to rest. This is an editorial the other day in the Wall Street Journal. And this is, again, hitting on an issue that I think is an issue that is often overlooked in people, by a lot of us that talk about end times and Bible prophecy and that sort of thing, because the demographics of the world are changing. Everybody is getting older. I saw an article in Friday's Wall Street Journal about, or maybe yesterday's, about because of aging baby boomers who have bought homes and vacation places like Sun City, Arizona, the villages down in Florida, there's soon going to be an excess of something like, it was either 17 or 21 million homes that people won't be able to buy because there's too many homes, but they're not buyers coming up to replace them because there were less people in the next generation than in this generation. And this is happening to China, it's happening to Iran, it's happening throughout the world. Europe has a big problem, has a demographic problem. One of the biggest demographic problems in the world is Japan. Japan is rapidly aging. China is rapidly aging, and within a generation, given current trends, because of one-child policy and growing affluence and that sort of thing, China will have over 300 million fewer people than they do today. Some countries are going to continue to grow for a while, particularly in Africa, India, and other places, but a lot of these people that are players in Bible prophecy, my point is that they're hitting a demographic wall, and the leaders know they're hitting that wall, and the leaders know that if they're going to do something, their time is short. Now, things could change, okay? I think this, I don't know how long these things will take to unfold in the end times. But I know if you go down 30 or 40 years down the road, Europe of today is not the Europe of 30 or 40 years from now. Because of immigration, mostly from the Muslim world, it will radically change. When we were in London a year ago, we were in London. We were a few blocks from Speaker's Corner in Hyde Park. And on our channel, our cable in the hotel, they had 50 channels. And 9 or 10 of them were Arabic language. And this is in the heart of London. So the world is changing, And this demographics plays a lot of it. And I think we need to look at that in light of what's going to happen with Bible prophecy. Now, Saudi Arabia did start public offering, at least in limited markets, of Aramco. Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman wanted the IPO to become outvalued about 2 to 2.2 trillion. It looks like it's going to be about 1.5 to 1.7 trillion. Still a lot of money. He has a lot of projects that he wants to do. And people who have opposed his plan in Saudi Arabia have been removed. You know, he arrested a bunch of people early after he became crown prince, and they paid billions essentially to get out. That was their get out of jail price, including the man who just resigned as prime minister of Lebanon, Hariri, who also has Saudi Arabian citizenship. The word is he paid something like, remember he had that video from Saudi Arabia where he resigned as prime minister of Lebanon? And he was in Saudi Arabia for a while, and then he went home, and the word is, at least from sources that I've read, say that he paid about $7 billion to get out of jail. Now that's interesting because he's tied to the political system in Lebanon, and that's a lot too. It's like Hariri family has billions of dollars, and people are poor, and people are rising up against that. More about that in a little bit. This was an important announcement this week. Secretary of State Pompeo announced the new policy of the Trump administration that the West Bank settlements are not illegal per se. Now, this was a big change. So I'm going to do a little bit of a deep dive to sort of remind you what happened historically. Here's a little video montage that I put together with Pompeo's statement and some of the things that happened back in late December 2016, after the 2016 election, but before President Trump was sworn in, the things that went on in the UN with regard to Resolution 2334. So here's Secretary of State Pompeo.
Turning now to Israel. The Trump administration is reversing the Obama administration's approach towards Israeli settlements. U.S. public statements on settlement activities in the West Bank have been inconsistent over decades. In 1978, the Carter administration categorically concluded that Israel's establishment of civilian settlements was inconsistent with international law.
In 1978, the State Department legal advisor advised the Congress of his conclusion that Israel's government, the Israeli government's program of establishing civilian settlements in the occupied territory is inconsistent with international law.
However, in 1981, President Reagan disagreed with that conclusion and stated that he didn't believe that the settlements were inherently illegal. Subsequent administrations recognized that unrestrained settlement activity could be an obstacle to peace, but they wisely and prudently recognized that dwelling on legal positions didn't advance peace. However, in December 2016, at the very end of the previous administration, Secretary Kerry changed decades of this careful bipartisan approach by publicly reaffirming the supposed illegality of settlements.
But if more and more settlers are moving into the middle of Palestinian areas, it's going to be just that much harder to separate, that much harder to imagine transferring sovereignty. And that is exactly the outcome that some are purposefully accelerating. Let's be clear. Settlement expansion has nothing to do with Israel's security. Many settlements actually increase the security burden on the Israeli Defense Forces. And leaders of the settler movement are motivated by ideological imperatives that entirely ignore legitimate Palestinian aspirations. Among the most troubling illustrations of this point has been the proliferation of settler outposts that are illegal under Israel's own laws. So the settler agenda is defining the future of Israel. And their stated purpose is clear. They believe in one state, Greater Israel. In fact, one prominent minister who heads a pro-settler party declared just after the U.S. election, and I quote, "The era of the two-state solution is over," end quote. And many other coalition ministers publicly reject a Palestinian state.
Your Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu, claims to believe in a two-state solution to the Israel-Palestine conflict. Do you believe in a two-state solution?
My personal view is different from the Prime Minister. I don't think it's a valid solution right now. We tried this solution once when we withdraw till the last inch from Gaza Strip. We got only terrors. The Palestinians, unfortunately, instead of building a Gaza Strip as the Singapore of the Middle East, they choose the terror path and just build tunnels to our village and rockets to our towns.
Well, and that was the minister that he was talking about. By the way, and I had mercy on you, John Kerry spoke for an hour and 15 minutes on December 28th, 2016. I've reviewed it a number of times. You're welcome. And I clipped it down. And the person he referred to was Naftali Bennett, who is now the acting defense minister of the state of Israel. And this is Ayelet Shaked, who is one of the New Right Party leader, and she served as justice minister for a time under the most recent Netanyahu cabinet. So you can see that these people do speak against it, and they were referring to this letter, this analysis that was done under the Carter administration by somebody in the legal advisor office there that essentially said, while Israel may undertake in the occupied territories actions necessary to meet its military needs, and for the reasons indicated above, the establishment of the civilian settlements in those territories is inconsistent with international law. Now this happened, this kind of unfolded at the UN. Egypt had made a proposal to declare the settlements illegal. There was a lot of pushing in the back rooms, and Egypt eventually withdrew that, but then it was reintroduced to the UN Security Council on December 23rd, 2016. This is, again, about 6 or 7 weeks after the election. The incoming Trump administration said, don't do this, don't do this, don't do this. And amazingly, the Obama administration said, we don't care. We're in charge. We're going to do whatever we want. We're going to change law. So to this time, even though there was a lot of vague language by United States governments, some acknowledging that the settlements were illegal or not the best idea, there really wasn't any overt action taken by the United States to tell Israel to really back off in constructing settlements and that sort of thing. So the UN brought up this resolution 2334 and put it to a vote of the UN Security Council. 14 people at the UN Security Council voted in favor of it, and you can see here there's a little bit going on. And then Samantha Power gave a little speech about it.
There are important issues that are not sufficiently addressed in this resolution, and because the United States does not agree with every word in this text, that the United States did not vote in favor of the resolution. Our vote today does not in any way diminish the United States' steadfast and unparalleled commitment to the security of Israel, the only democracy in the Middle East. We would not have let this resolution pass had it not also addressed counterproductive actions by the Palestinians. Some may cast the U.S. vote as a sign that we have finally given up on a two-state solution. Nothing could be further from the truth. None of us can give up on a two-state solution. We continue to believe that that solution is the only viable path to provide peace and security for the state of Israel and freedom and dignity for the Palestinian people.
And when it came up, what happened was they asked for those in favor. 14 of the 15 nations on the Security Council voted in favor of Resolution 2334. They then asked for people, are you against 2334? And nobody voted. And they said, are there any abstentions? And Samantha Power, as you can see in the photograph, she raised her hand. And this was really the first time the United States had ever refused to exercise its veto power at the UN Security Council. So now Resolution 2334 has come into place. So this is being reversed by Secretary of State Pompeo, who I'm very much more comfortable with and like playing his video clips much more than I did the prior Secretary of State and the Secretary of State before John Kerry, who shall remain nameless. But here's some further comments from Secretary Pompeo on, this was on Monday or Tuesday.
Look, we recognize that as Israeli courts have the legal conclusions relating to individual settlements must depend on an assessment of specific facts and circumstances on the ground. Therefore, the United States government is expressing no view on the legal status of any individual settlement. We're not addressing or prejudging the ultimate status of the West Bank. This is for the Israelis and the Palestinians to negotiate. International law does not compel a particular outcome nor create any legal obstacle to a negotiated resolution. Third, the conclusion that we will no longer recognize Israeli settlements as per se inconsistent with international law is based on the unique facts, history, and circumstances presented by the establishment of civilian settlements in the West Bank. Our decision today does not prejudice or decide legal conclusions regarding situations in any other parts of the world. And finally, calling the establishment of civilian settlements inconsistent with international law hasn't worked. It hasn't advanced the cause of peace. The hard truth is, there will never be a judicial resolution to the conflict, and arguments about who is right and wrong as a matter of international law will not bring peace. This is a complex political problem that can only be solved by negotiations between the Israelis and the Palestinians.
Now, I might add that there are good arguments under international law to support the conclusion of the Trump administration and Secretary of State Pompeo on this particular issue. There is also a very good video out there. You can find it at jcpa.org, the Jerusalem Center for Public Affairs, jcpa.org. It is done by a French lawyer, and we all love lawyers. We all love long videos by lawyers, right? His name is Gautier, Gautier, I believe, and he has gone through and analyzed what the treaties coming out of World War II, Sykes-Picot, the Treaty of Lausanne, the Treaty of San Remo, and these type of things. And his conclusion is, and he makes a very compelling case. It's about an hour and 15-minute video. It was done back about 5 or 6 years ago. And his conclusion is, look, legally, this land that we're fighting over now was given to Israel by the world community. And that's the last place where the world community, everybody in the world agreed. But nobody wants to recognize this. You know, now, and who, just the question is, Israel came into existence as a separate sovereign nation on May 14th, 1948. They were immediately attacked. We know in 1967, there was an invasion. The Arab countries had massed all around Saudi Arabia, Jordan, Egypt, Iraq, and Lebanon and Syria. And so Israel said, okay, we're not going to, we got to protect ourselves. It's interesting, who had this area called the West Bank between 1948 and 1967? Was it the country of Palestine, right? No, it was Jordan. But they've never acted like they want it now. But so they don't, again, this thing is, there was a two-state solution. Now they want a 3 or 4 state solution. And I really recommend that you find Attorney Gautier's, I think that's his name. I got the G part right, I know that. I really recommend that you watch his video, because I think it will give you a deeper understanding of the international law legalities. And so I will say, I agree with Secretary of State Pompeo that, and the interesting thing is, I agree with him that these settlements are not illegal under international law. And I would also say is that this exposes what they want. They want Jew-free areas. And so here's some of the reactions to Secretary of State Pompeo. You may have met the UN. They have a very extensive website, by the way. UN Multimedia will get you to it. And they either sell a lot of coffee, or these people are able to sleep with their eyes open from these meetings. They go for hours and hours. But here's some of this is called a media stakeout. It's hardly a stakeout like we're going to get these guys because they have the podium and everything set up. It's where people go when they want to pontificate on an issue. So here is the British Secretary of State. Her name is, well, here she speaks.
Our position on Israeli settlement policy in the occupied Palestinian territory, including East Jerusalem, is clear and remains unchanged. All settlement activity is illegal under international law, and it erodes the viability of the two-state solution and the prospects for a lasting peace, as reaffirmed by UN Security Council Resolution 2334. We call on Israel to end all settlement activity in line with its obligations as an occupying power. We also reiterate our concern about the calls for possible annexation of areas in the West Bank. We will continue to support a resumption of a meaningful process towards a negotiated two-state solution, the only realistic and viable way to fulfill the legitimate aspirations of both parties.
Dame, I think her last name is Haynes or something like this. Anyway, now here's the man in the red circle is the Indonesian ambassador to the UN. Now, I didn't have time to edit a clip, but I have a clip of the current prime minister of Indonesia, who's in his 90s. He's like 93 or 94. He's the oldest. He's older than Queen Elizabeth, okay, if you can imagine that. And he's come back into power. And there was a recent, in September, October, he did one of these dialogues at the Columbia University in New York. And a Jewish student got up and said, "You've made anti-Semitic statements in the past, and my parents are survivors, or my grandparents were survivors of the Holocaust, and you know what you say makes me very uncomfortable, etc." And his reaction to this is the Indonesian prime minister, a Muslim country, by the way, and pray for the persecuted church in Indonesia, said, "Hey, well, I'm just exercising my free speech." He didn't deny that he was anti-Semitic. And it was pretty clear. So here is his ambassador, the ambassador from Indonesia, to the UN, making short comments about where he stands in Indonesia.
So this is a clear statement from us all, the E10, the elected 10, that what has been done by Israel in the issue of the settlement as well as other issues constitute a annexation of the area.
And it's interesting. This is what you see at the UN when there's an open mic and cameras. You know, there's all these people crowding to get into the picture. It looks just like the Congress of the United States. Whenever you ever see that rugby scrums don't have that kind of pushing and shoving to get in front of the camera, as we see in the halls of our esteemed congressional building. Here is Ryan Mansour, who actually went to Youngstown State, by the way. He is the Palestinian representative to the UN.
The nonsense of one delegation inside the chamber saying that you international community, if you abide by international law, you help the Palestinians not to come to negotiation. If we abandon international law, including Security Council resolution, it will be the law of the jungle.
And here's what that one country had to say, Ambassador Danny Danon from Israel.
We hope that the rest of the international community will find the courage to review the US policy with an unbiased eye. Judea and Samaria are inseparable parts of the Jewish people's homeland. This is not a recent development or claim, but a historical truth that will never again be denied.
Well, the Pope weighed in. You can imagine where the Pope came down on this, issuing his statement. By the way, when we were kids growing up, instead of saying yes to somebody asking you a question, you would say something like, "Well, is the Pope Catholic?" Okay, we need to change that now. So the answer to that is because you want something that's an obvious yes answer. So is the Pope Marxist or is the Pope a leftist? That's the hell you should do those things now, okay? Because he's not Catholic. And there's plenty of Catholics that are upset with him. So they issued a thing. that, we have to have a two-state solution. The context of recent decisions that risk undermining further the Israeli-Palestinian peace process and the already fragile regional stability. The Holy See reiterates its position of a two-state solution for two peoples as the only way to reach a complete solution to this age-old conflict. The European Union got together, and it was very interesting what happened at the European Union. They wanted to issue a statement, but because of their rules, they have to do it unanimously. So they did release this press statement, because this was sort of the view of almost all of the countries. The European Union's position is clear and remains unchanged. All settlement activity is illegal under international law and erodes the viability of the two-state solution and the prospects for a lasting peace, as reaffirmed by UN Security Council Resolution 2334. And Secretary of State Pompeo addressed this, and he said, listen, this never worked. It's never worked. What's the definition of insanity? You continue to do the same thing and hope for a different result. Now, the reason that they did not have a unanimous consent to this was this, and this is an article out of the Times of Israel. Budapest, Hungary, nation of Hungary, blocks joint EU statement condemning U.S. shift on settlements. An effort to get all 28 European Union member states to issue a joint statement condemning the U.S. decision to no longer consider Israeli settlements is being blocked by Hungary, according to a diplomatic source with direct knowledge of the matter. So that's what happened, and so this was a big deal. So this was a very big deal. Caroline Glick, it was front page news, and the New York Times had sort of an article, you could tell where they were coming from. In reversal, U.S. sides with Israel on settlements. Boy, this is a shift removes the barrier to annexing land in the West Bank. And they were very upset about this. Now, there were lots of editorials and articles about this. Caroline Glick, she wrote about it in Israel Hayom. That's the newspaper that she does. There's an English language version available online. And she has a very good article talking about, the title of the article is, Pompeo's statement on Israeli settlements is a diplomatic turning point. Now, she recently spoke at the Renaissance Weekend down in Palm Beach, Florida, and at that time she had kind of gone through sort of the parallels of what's going on in Israeli politics with what's going on in U.S. politics. You may have noticed Prime Minister Netanyahu is having some problems, and President Trump is having some problems. And by the way, I don't want to get off on the impeachment thing, just in the sense that I think it sort of shows that in these end times that geopolitics are going to be very chaotic. I don't think that the witnesses called really proved much of anything. A lot of them came and said, well, yeah, I didn't hear that phone call either. To which led to one of my friends to post on our Facebook page, I'm concerned I might get subpoenaed to Congress because I didn't hear the phone call either. And Fiona Hill, oh my goodness, was that, she was part of the Open Society Foundation, which is a George Soros funded group. I just suggesting she might be a plant. So here's Caroline saying this: Monday will long be remembered as a turning point in Middle East history. U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo's statement Monday that Israeli settlements are not illegal per se is the most significant shift in U.S. Middle East policy in the past generation. I think she's spot on this. In the interest of promoting peace, Pompeo instead told the truth. Not only are Israeli settlements not illegal, Pompeo noted that they are arguably more justified than civilian settlements built in other disputed territories in other countries around the world. Pompeo's statement, and indeed the Trump administration's decision to publish its position, now represents a complete rebuke of the European Union. Since taking office, Trump has worked consistently to align U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East and beyond the world as it is, rather than to the world as experts imagine it to be. Good points that she made in her article. Here's another one. In the Middle East, this realignment of U.S. policy has provided the nations of the region, including Israel and the Palestinians, with the first chance of reaching genuine peace they have ever had. Now, while all of this is going on, Israel launched some attacks into Syria. They attacked sites around Damascus. My understanding is they hit the headquarters of Al-Quds, which is the Iranian Revolutionary Guard headquarters, one of their militias. There were, I heard 24 people killed in those attacks. And it's interesting, if you watch the one on the left, you kind of see one of the missiles kind of take off to go after, and it kind of got confused. So you see how it goes up? And so I'm going to get the Israeli, no, I'm going to go back and I'm going to hit Damascus. So sometimes the wounds are self-inflicted. So won't talk about the Jordanian Valley because we don't have time to do that today. So while all of this is going on, there were a lot of articles this week about a wave of protests that rattles governments. All over the world, these protests are taking place. And they usually, the trigger is something minor, like Chile has millions of people out protesting because they raise subway or bus fare. Lebanon, Iraq, all of these other people. Here's a picture of what's going on in Chile. This is from Al-Quds newspaper it's published in Arabic language, published in London. And it notes, listen, it's even happening in Chile, which they know was one of the most stable in South America. We also have the ongoing protests in Hong Kong. And we don't know how ugly this would get. They had some elections, I think, the other day or yesterday, or they're having some elections. And some of them are saying, well, the protests are petering out. And it's dividing Hong Kong society. I mean, in Hong Kong, and parts of it are in complete meltdown. I was talking to a friend who spent a lot of time in Hong Kong because we have businesses in the U.S. here in Columbus that do a lot of business overseas, especially in Asia and Hong Kong and China. And he's saying I used to walk in those places and there are riots, there's burning, people are being attacked. And so this one campus was essentially put together. The other thing that came out this week was the New York Times also had an extensive article, very well done, I think, talking about they got access to about 700 pages of documents between Iran and people in Iraq about how Iran exercised its influence over Iraq. And it's kind of interesting. Look, the United States went in, broke Iraq, and the Iranians came in and filled the vacuum. And so for the last 10 or 15 years, they've been working very carefully to put all of these militias in place. And so these communiques show that General Soleimani, the head of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps, has been very involved in this. The picture on the right of that last article, this is Mosul. It's a relatively recent picture of Mosul. This is after the battle to defeat ISIS that took place there. This is a picture of people that are going through the buildings and getting rid of the bodies that they can find of all the people that were killed. I mean, and this picture is repeated all over the Middle East. I just don't think we can really grasp or have any understanding as to exactly what's going on. So, as they said in the New York Times article, Iran found an opening after the U.S. invaded. And this is a big problem. Now, what's happened, though, is the people in Iraq are tired of this. They have essentially come and they've said, look, we want our country back. We don't want this Iranian influence. In fact, the Wall Street Journal article makes the point in here. Here's what the Wall Street Journal article said yesterday when they looked at Lebanon, they looked at Iraq, they looked at Chile, they looked at all these places all over the world. Bolivia got rid of their dictator. And some of these are good. I mean, he had turned it into essentially a narco state. But the article in the Wall Street Journal yesterday says this, but when political unrest breaks out on such a scale, there are usually also common factors and a deeper underlying cause shared by those taking to the streets. Can we discern the outlines of a pattern in the disparate threads of the popular revolts of 2019? Well, it could be dissatisfaction with economics, but it could also be about freedom, like it is in Hong Kong. And the people in Hong Kong, they see what's happening to the Uyghurs. They're smart people. They don't want this to happen. So it says here, but it isn't just material discontent behind the insurrectionist fervor. The movements in the Arab world especially have deep political causes. Some have already taken to calling this year's demonstration in the Middle East and Africa Arab Spring 2.0. That may be overstating the extent of the revolutionary zeal, and one certainly hopes that this version ends better than the original. Something that analysts say distinguishes the protests in Arab countries from previous bursts of popular discontent is that they are largely non-sectarian in nature. The unrest in Lebanon, along a powder keg of religious and sectarian tensions, has this time been explicitly secular and unifying rather than pitting one religious group another. Even in Iraq, where Sunni Shiite divisions have claimed hundreds of thousands of lives in the past 20 years, traditional sectarian tensions have been less important this time than common anger at governing corruption, incompetence, and external interference. But one thing that is clear is that this is a very turbulent time in world history. And so Tehran and Iran, they're having riots all over the country over they're rationing gas. One of the most oil-rich countries in the world is essentially rationing gas because, and I mentioned last week, their budget, they only have about 1/3 of the money they need to cover the government's budget. So the sanctions are having an impact. And in Iraq, they said, our patience with this is over. We're done with this. We're tired of waiting. And if this takes, one of the quotes of one of the protesters was, if this goes on for 40 years, that's okay with us because we're young and we're not going to take it anymore. So this is turmoil roaring the world. Now, one interesting thing in London, they had a conference this week about being against the boycott, divest, and sanction rules that the European Union is trying to put in place. This was an Arab conference talking about how we need to do business with Israel. So in other words, every time you get up here this Sunday, it's like the world's not the same as it was a week ago. It's certainly not the same that it was 2 weeks ago or a month ago. Things are changing very rapidly, and I think this is going to be. Now, in Europe, Macron, now there was the Economist cover, and they had Macron walking on the water, but my view is that Macron has been sinking a bit, so I photoshopped this and put it together. But he actually came out with an interview in The Economist a couple weeks ago and said the European Union is on the edge of a precipice, and I don't know if it's going to survive. And we're at a very critical juncture. There were reports this week that Macron and Angela Merkel of Germany are not getting along. They have very different visions as to how things are going. The Yellow Vest protests continue, and so even Europe, in the elite areas of Europe, they're having problems. Now, another place that they're having problems is Israel. We know that Israel has had 2 elections with no prime minister being selected. Everything seems to be in a stalemate. So what happened this week was that Danny Gantz, Netanyahu was given the mandate, go form a government. He failed. He went back to President Rivlin, said, I can't form a government. I can't get the 61 votes I needed to make me prime minister. So Danny Gantz came. During this time, Netanyahu and Gantz are talking, and Gantz even seemed to be sort of leaning towards maybe entering into a coalition government with Netanyahu where they would rotate the prime minister position. But Gantz went back and talked to his people, and really when you look at it, the blue and white party, they seem to be concerned about the security of the state of Israel, but what they really stand for is very similar to a party in the United States. They oppose the guy in the big office. That's their unifying principle. That's really what they're about. And so when Gantz went back to blue and white, they said, nope, Danny, we gotta get rid of Netanyahu. Got to get rid of him. He's had too much time. So what happened then was Netanyahu got indicted on 3 charges in an indictment. Now, Israeli politics are a little bit difficult or at least the Israeli legal system is not like us. I mean, we have a constitution and everything. They have basic law and that type of thing. So in today's Israel Hayom, Caroline Glick has a very good article sort of going through the process. I would highly recommend that you read it. It's called The Reign of the Prosecution. And her point is, and it's a point that I think I've tried to make in the past, is that in a democracy, the person who you really ought to be afraid of is a rogue prosecutor. Now, just take my word for it. I'm a lawyer. I know what I'm talking about. I've seen this happen, and I've seen prosecutors push people into agreements because they're afraid, or they get them in these long interviews, and if you tell one thing that you may not remember it, and they'll say you're lying, and they'll charge you with a process crime, and you can go to prison if you don't tell the truth in an FBI interview. I've seen this happen over and over again. And Caroline Glick says this is exactly what happened in the investigation of Netanyahu. They took people, they put them in, essentially, you're going to go to prison, you're not going to see your family unless you turn state's evidence. And so that's what has happened, and there's been this concerted push. And I think she's correct in saying is that, so last February, when the first election occurred, Netanyahu called for elections, and the Likud was pretty far in the polls. So what happened? The Attorney General, a guy named Mandevelt, came out and he said, I'm going to indict Netanyahu. So what happened? Netanyahu fell in the polls. The results of the election didn't have a very good, nobody could get a majority. So they went through a second round of election, and now they're in a state where Netanyahu failed, Gantz has failed, and now the other day, President Rivlin said, okay, anybody in the Knesset can form a coalition government if they can get 61 votes and come to me and say, I'm going to be prime minister. They have 21 days to do that, so about 2.5 weeks left. I doubt that anybody's going to be able to do that if the big guys haven't been able to do it. People in the Likud are calling for Netanyahu to get out. And so the charges by Mandevelt, they come out, his announcement comes out, I'm indicting him, I'm going forward on this. Comes out, why? Because he's trying to damage Netanyahu for the next elections. And it's chaos. It's so similar to what's going on in the United States. It's pretty clear that they're very similar. So Caroline says this in her article, but then that is the entire point of going after Netanyahu with invented crimes. Now that Netanyahu has been charged for bribery, and incidentally, he never even received positive coverage from the media. He was accused of trying to get positive coverage in the media. Like, I've never heard of a politician doing that. Okay? And so he didn't even really, like in the one case, it was like the coverage in the one newspaper was like 90% negative, and Netanyahu kind of pushed on the guy and got it down to 70% negative. And this is bribery by this guy who's trying to take down the Israeli government, Netanyahu. I'm telling you what you ought to, there's a prophetic passage that talks about you're going to be brought before what? Magistrates and judges. Okay, this is what I think is going to happen in the end times. So get Caroline's article. She concludes with this: politicians may make us happy or sad, frustrated or infuriated, but today in post-democratic Israel, it hardly matters. Netanyahu called last night for an investigation of the investigators. Unless our elected officials join forces to heed his call, they and the voters who elected them will never be relevant again. Now this is Caroline Glick, who's a pretty in my view, a pretty rational person. Can we agree that things are in a state of turmoil? I used to have a tax professor, and he would always go, folks, until we move on, are we in agreement on this? Do we agree on this? And he would always say, if there's any disagreement, we're going to have to go back and cover it over. Well, nobody would ever say they disagree because we don't want to listen to more lecture on tax. So this is what's going on in Israeli politics. There are also things that are going on. Russia is getting upset with Israel with the strikes in Israel. Here's just a little summary. You can look at Haaretz had a pretty good summary of the different charges that are coming against Netanyahu. Now, one thing that's noted in Caroline Glick's article is this, is it's not really an indictment yet. Because he's a member of the Knesset, Netanyahu is, it's got to kind of go through the Knesset process. But then the question is, do we really have a Knesset? Because nobody's been able to form a government. And there's also the fact that Netanyahu can ask the Knesset to give him immunity. But then the question is, if the Knesset votes to give him immunity, is it really valid because the Knesset really hasn't been formed, per se? And you know what the Israeli Supreme Court would do with this. They're leftist. They're going to do whatever they want. Just like the leftists on our court do this as in the United States. And by the way, I saw that Ruth Bader Ginsburg was in the hospital again. My understanding is she's getting her cryogenic tank topped off. So that's just I'm speculating, okay? So here's this. Gantz told Netanyahu, look, if you're a patriot, you should quit. Well, maybe if you're a patriot, you should fight against the injustice of this out-of-control system. I mean, who said you get to determine who's a patriot, Benny Gantz? Maybe you're wrong. Maybe you're as wrong as people in this country are that I won't name. Now, I want to close with this. I'll just probably play the first clip. There's a conference going on in Bahrain right now called the Manama Dialogues. I've played clips from this. It happens every fall. And, for example, General McKenzie, who's the commander in the Middle East region for the Central Command, head of Central Command for the U.S. forces in the Middle East and in that region, he spoke at the conference yesterday. And he just said that we're trying to up the number of troops that we have in the Middle East, but I still think Iran's going to attack based on the intelligence and everything that I have. And he was there advocating for cooperation among all the participants in the conference, Saudi Arabia, Jordan, mostly the southern Egypt, Bahrain, United Arab Emirates, Oman. I don't know that Qatar was there, or certainly the Iranians were not, and the Syrians were not, and the Russians were not, but they were talking about cooperation. But I thought one of the most significant speeches was Florence Parly, who is the head of the French Armed Forces, played a short clip of hers at the beginning. Here's a longer, about 3 or 4 minute clip. Now, we understand that we have sort of a basic understanding of how these things work out from Bible prophecy, right? I want you to sort of take that knowledge, that framework, and listen to what she has to say. Now, I'm sure she's secular, but just listen to this, because I found it to be one of the more significant speeches I heard.
No place better exemplifies this than the Gulf. When the mining of ships went unanswered, a drone got shot. When that, in turn, went unanswered, major oil facilities were bombed. Where does it stop? Where are the stabilizers? This is dangerous, even for those who think they gain, because bold is never far from daring, and daring never far from reckless. Even the fight against terror hardly manages to unite us all. A sad example was the way Turkey recently cracked down on the Kurdish Arab militias that helped us roll back Daesh.
Excuse me one second. I have another, I'm not sure what happened to my other clip of hers, so give me 1 second here. We'll insert that clip. And she takes on, by the way, in case you didn't pick up on it, she's going to take on President Trump and his withdrawal from the Middle East some here in her speech. Okay, so here's the few-minute clip that I wanted to play.
But first, allow me to ask you to pause for a minute and think how far things have changed recently. 4 years ago, in the corridors of this very building, many of you were stunned, watching on screens the images of cruise missiles fired from the Caspian Sea into Syria. Those images resonated strangely. How could they not summon those other images of missiles fired into Iraq 12 years before? Except this time, they were caliber instead of tomahawks. Closer to us, there were the images of a meeting in Astana, that remote bit of Central Asia, where 3 non-Arab leaders pretended to adjudicate Syria, that quite essential Arab country.
Russia, Iran, and Turkey.
And closer still, we had images of bearded generals inspecting the debris of a US drone shot down over the Gulf, that mighty piece of technology being paraded on Fox News. The Middle East is an empire of signs. Nowhere is the art of messaging more sophisticated, and nowhere is a propensity to interpret symbols stronger than in this region. The signs are plain for all to see, and they hint at the severe weakening of an order based on cooperation that makes of US presence, norms, a degree of multilateralism, some stability of governance, and a great deal of deterrence. For what has happened as this decade is coming to a close? We've seen a deliberate, gradual US disengagement. It had been in the cards for a while, but it became clear when fighter jets remained on the tarmac in 2013 after the Syrian chemical attacks, or later after the downing of a US UAV and the bombing of Saudi oil facilities. With the cornerstone moving, the edifice has started shaking, and opportunists to rush in. The region is accustomed to the ebb and flow of US involvement, but this time it seemed more serious, courtesy of the fracking revolution and the rise of China. It is a slow process, after all. Hasn't a US carrier strike group just entered the Gulf? But the trend is, I think, quite clear, and thus probably irrespective of who wins the next election. As a result, with several actors stepping in to fill the vacuum, we've seen the landscape become more complex and entangled, with Turkish spoken in Isa, Russian in Benghazi, and even Chinese in nearby Djibouti. With the US looking sometimes elsewhere, An entire grammar of deterrence needs to be reinvented.
And she goes on and she talks about all the things that are going on. By the way, her reference to Isa, I believe, is Turkish being spoken in Algeria. Because Turkey is using its contacts through the Muslim Brotherhood to try to destabilize countries. They want Egypt and that sort of thing. So I'm just telling you is that this is a secular person, very intelligent, and she's talking about these themes about how everything is unstable, there's a vacuum, things are being, the United States is withdrawn, and essentially I think if you take her thinking a little bit further, it's sort of like, isn't there somebody who can come in and lead us through this mess? Do you see what I'm saying? It's one of the most important security conferences on the planet that's taking place, and it's happening right in front of us. Now, look, I will admit, it is very disconcerting world that we live in. I mean, it would be easy to say, where's God? Is he not in control anymore? We see the things happening in our schools, people losing their jobs because they oppose this stuff, YouTube channels being shut down, all this stuff. But listen, God is in control. The other day I was kind of, I'd had it, and I flipped on the Brooklyn Tabernacle Choir, singing Psalm 34. So I thought today I'd close with Psalm 34. Look it up online, by the way. It's quite time. I will bless the Lord at all times. His praise shall continually be in my mouth. My soul shall make her boast in the Lord. The humble shall hear thereof and be glad. O magnify the Lord with me, and let us exalt his name together. I sought the Lord, and he heard me, and he delivered me from all my fears. They looked unto him and were lightened, and their faces were not ashamed. This poor man cried, and the Lord heard him and saved him out of all of his troubles. The angel of the Lord encampeth round about them that fear him, and delivereth them. O taste and see that the Lord is good. Blessed is the man that trusteth in him. O fear the Lord, ye his saints, for there is no want to them that fear him. The young lions do lack and suffer hunger, but they that seek the Lord shall not want any good thing. Come, ye children, hearken unto me. I will teach you the fear of the Lord. By the way, sidebar comment. We have lost in our culture and world today the fear of the Lord. Do you think those people who voted in Palatine, Illinois, that school board, do you think they fear the Lord? I guarantee you they do not. What man, verse 12, is he that desireth life and loveth many days, that he may see good? Keep thy tongue from evil and thy lips from speaking guile. Depart from evil and do good. Seek peace and pursue it. The eyes of the Lord are upon the righteous, and his ears are open unto their cry. The face of the Lord is against them that do evil, to cut off the remembrance of them from the earth. The righteous cry, and the Lord heareth, and delivereth them out of all their troubles. The Lord is nigh unto them that are of a broken heart, and saveth such as be a contrite spirit. Many are the afflictions of the righteous, but the Lord delivereth him out of them all. He keepeth all his bones, not one of them is broken. Evil shall slay the wicked, and they that hate the righteous shall be desolate. The Lord redeemeth the soul of his servants, and none of them that trust in him shall be desolate. And I might add, in any circumstance. Father, thank you so much for the comfort of your word. Bless us this week. In the name of your Son, Jesus Christ, our Lord and Savior. Amen.